that was his way of, God willing, we'll complete not complete the life, but we'll complete what we're going to talk about, and that'll take us from the beginning of the First World War until his death in the 1930s. This concluding lecture on the life of the chafetz chaim is dedicated in the memory of Golda Rizke Bat Chizkio Akoin Grandowski by her children Charles and Shulamis Grandowski. The yahrzeit is on the 27th day of Shvat. The chafetz chaim was already an old man when the First World War broke out in 1914. He was in his 70s. However, the period of the First World War and the period after the First World War really serves as a very important period in his life and reflects even more graphically than perhaps any other time the tremendous inner strength and greatness of chafetz chaim, because he at a time when the Jewish world, especially in Europe, needed leadership, he arose as the leader of the Jewish people. Until this time, even though he was well known as a pious and holy man and a great scholar, his leadership role was not primary. However, from this time on, he became the spokesman for the Jewish people, and he undertook upon himself, in spite of his advanced age, and that's true throughout the he undertook upon himself the role of responsibility, not only for his own yeshiva, but for the Jewish community in Lithuania and Poland generally. When the German army came close to Rodden in the beginning of the war in 1914, so the Jews were of two minds. And that's true throughout the Jewish sections of where the war took place. It's one of the great tragedies in Jewish history was World War I. If it would not have been for the terrible Holocaust of World War II, then World War I would be the major disaster in Jewish history. We don't think of it in those terms because it was so eclipsed by what happened later. But the Tsar of Russia, smarting from his terrible defeat, looked for a scapegoat. And the scapegoat was naturally the Jewish people. And part of the treatment of the Jewish people was to force them to evacuate their homes in the Pale of Settlement, which was where the battles were being fought. And hundreds of thousands of Jews were driven into interior Russia as refugees with no means of support, certainly no governmental infrastructure to deal with them. And thousands and tens of thousands of them died of hunger, of disease, of exposure. Because of this, many Jews felt that they were better off under German domination than under Russian domination. And the German army, in fact, brought with it Jewish chaplains, Jewish rabbis. Some of them were Orthodox Jewish rabbis who tended to the needs of the Polish and Lithuanian Jewish population. And the German occupation, at least as far as Jews were concerned in the First World War, was benign. It was not only tolerable, it was an improvement over the Russians. And that memory, unfortunately, fooled many Jews when the Second World War started, because they remembered that 20 years earlier, or 24 years earlier, the Germans came and they were not the vicious, cruel people that they were made out to be, and therefore Jews had hope that somehow the new Germans would be like the old Germans. Unfortunately, that hope was misplaced. But because of this, the Jews were of two minds, whether to flee or whether to stay. Now, those that had no choice, that the Tsar's Russian army drove into the interior, they had no choice. But those Jews who somehow escaped the order, they had a choice. The chafetz chaim himself was in doubt as to what to do when the German army was at the doorsteps of Radin. His decision was to split the yeshiva. Rabbi Moshe Lambinsky, that's the grandfather of Rabbi Plato's wife, was appointed Rosh Yeshiva and stayed with a proportion of the boys, of the students, in Radin. With about a third of the yeshiva stayed in Radin. 2/3 of the yeshiva left with the chafetz chaim. The chafetz chaim and his son-in-law, Rav Hirsch, left and proceeded into interior Russia. The idea was that the chafetz chaim wanted the yeshiva to continue under all circumstances, and he therefore felt that by splitting the yeshiva, he would guarantee that somehow at least one branch of the yeshiva would survive the war, and that there would be a sense of continuity. He also did not want to abandon completely the people of his hometown of Radin, where he had spent so many decades. He felt a responsibility to them, and he felt that as long as the yeshiva was in Radin, the Jewish community in Radin would be able to survive. However, deep down in his heart, he felt that the Germans would be a problem, and therefore he and his family and 2/3 of the yeshiva left Radin and went eastward into Russia. Included in those who left with him was the Rosh Yeshiva Rabbi Naftali Trop, and also one of the main disciples of the chafetz chaim, Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, who later became the head of the yeshiva in Baranovich, who was one of the famous Jewish personalities between the wars. And the yeshiva came and wandered. But yes, that's very hard for us to imagine the circumstances. But the yeshiva wandered for a year from town to town, under terrible, terrible physical circumstances, without any sure place to stay, without any certain provisions for food and shelter and any basic sanitary care. And again, one has to emphasize that the chafetz chaim here is a man in the 70s. But finally, in 1915, in Erev Yom Kippur, they came to the Russian city of Smilovitz, which is near Minsk, in White Russia, Yellow-Russia. When it became known that the chafetz chaim was in Smilovitz, so there were many students of different yeshivas that were refugees as individuals. And the chafetz chaim became a rallying point for all of the refugees that were yeshiva students. So that the yeshiva in Radin had about 350 students. The yeshiva in Smilovitz had almost double that number, because of the fact that individual students of other yeshivas came now to find themselves under the protection of the chafetz chaim. There are countless stories. The governmental authorities, the Russian governmental authorities, the Tsarist authorities, were not very happy that the yeshivas were in business. In fact, it was illegal, and there were regular searches made by the Tsar's police in the yeshiva to discover deserters from the army or draft dodgers, or why, when you have quite a few hundred young men of army age in the middle of a war, and they're not in the army, and especially in the middle of a war that the country is losing, that raises the hackles of the population. It is always a sore point. And therefore, the yeshiva was subject to these types of regular persecutions, regular investigations, searches, etc., to find these contraband students. And the chafetz chaim spent a great deal of his efforts in protecting the students from the Russian police and from service in the Russian army. He was not universally successful. Many were taken away by force. Many were accused of spying. We'll have one of the most dramatic stories of the chafetz chaim in a few moments. regarding one of his students that was accused of spying. It didn't take much for the Russian police to accuse you of spying. And Jews generally were held to be disloyal. I mean, that's the only word that one can use. They were generally held to be disloyal, and therefore subject to all sorts of suspicion, even though the Jews served in great numbers in the Russian army and were suffered a great many casualties, perhaps a disproportionate amount of casualties, because they usually were placed in groups or divisions of battalions that were much more susceptible to casualties. They didn't work in the back lines. But nevertheless, throughout the time, the Jews were suspected of not being loyal to the Russians. And that was a stigma that they could never remove. Again, the name of the chafetz was such that not only yeshiva students came to Svilivitz, it became the refugee center for the Jewish world in White Russia. Somehow people felt that if the chafetz was there, funds would be raised. Eventually, somebody would come to their aid. And they were not wrong in that, because the chafetz threw himself into the work of helping others. And one of his most famous speeches was in the Beis Medrash in Svilivitz, in the large synagogue. There were wealthy Jews in Svilivitz, and they looked with some sort of, I don't know how, not nice to say it, but they weren't as receptive to their fellow Jewish brethren as perhaps they should have been. One cannot judge others, but it's nobody likes to be invaded by strangers, even when the strangers are your cousins. Maybe especially when the strangers are your cousins. Like your brother-in-law moves in with you without notice. And therefore there was a small amount of resentment and of lack of help in large amounts to the newcomers. The chafetz mounted the pulpit and he said as follows: I'm an old man. He said, soon I'm going to have to report to the heavenly court regarding my activities on earth. So one of the things they'll ask me is, what was my attitude towards the people in Svilivitz? What did I ask them to do? How did the people in Svilivitz behave towards their less fortunate brothers? He said, shall I say that they were generous and good people? He said, I can't lie in front of the heavenly court. Shall I say that they were very penurious, miserly? They didn't behave as they should have. I can't say lashon hara. I can't say slander against them. So I don't know what to answer, he said. So therefore, you tell me what to answer. So they said that they raised an enormous amount of money at that meeting. That was the answer that was given to the chafetz. But the chafetz was the address for refugee aid in that section of the world. And he would not rest until some sort of arrangements were made. Terrible descriptions. I mean, all the synagogues, we talk about the homeless problem. All the synagogues were converted literally into dormitories. And there were free food kitchens. But the amount of refugees was enormous. Talking tens of thousands of Jews. And it was an enormous strain on everyone. The German army came to Svilivitz as well. Again, no one imagined that the First World War would take on the dimensions that it did. That it would involve the number of men and the number of casualties, that it would reach over the great amount of area that it did. It was unlike any war that had ever been fought before. So when it came to Svilivitz, the chafetz moved again. Chafetz was determined to somehow to stay away from the Germans. Much later, 50 years later, the legends developed that the chafetz sent the danger of the Germans to the Jewish people. Whether or not there's no way, that's an irrefutable story, but it's an unprovable one as well. There's no way to judge these things. But from the pattern of the chafetz in the First World War, we see that he went to great lengths to avoid being under German occupation. And he moved again. He took the yeshiva to its city called Sinyat, which was further into Russia. And now he began to move south towards the Ukraine. Before they were in White Russia, now they were closer to the Ukraine. In the Ukraine, there were a very large number of Jews. It's estimated close to 1 million Jews were there, again, of whom almost 40% were refugees. And the Ukrainians generally, whatever the Russians were, the Ukrainians are in spades, double. And it was a very inhospitable climate for the Jews. In the city of Homo, in the Ukraine, Reb Chaim who was the rabbi of Vilna and one of the great leaders of the Jewish people, who we're going to have a biography of him too, God willing. He had left Vilna also before the Germans captured it, and he lived now in Homo, which was in the border of the Ukraine and Russia. The chafetz chaim joined Reb Chaim Ozer, and they made a convention in Homo of the rabbis of Poland and Lithuania that had escaped into the Ukraine, and to try and organize Jewish life in the Ukraine. In the midst of this chaos, to try and set up an educational system, to set up schools, elementary schools, somehow to maintain the infrastructure of Jewish life. Again, I would like to emphasize that the First World War's main effect upon the Jews in Eastern Europe was that it destroyed the infrastructure of Jewish life. And therefore, it's no question, and there's no problem as to understanding how Jewish life fell apart as it did, and how so many turned out to be communists and socialists and secularists, etc., when the entire infrastructure of Jewish life was destroyed. Judaism requires institutions. It requires synagogue. It requires kosher butchers. It requires a mikveh. It requires an educational system. You can't be a Jew on your own. It's not, it's not Unitarianism or Christian Science or something else where, you just get up in the morning and say, I believe, and that does it. You have to have a shochet, you have to have a moel, you have to have a mikveh, you have to have a shul, you have to have film, and to be a Jew, it's a big package. And that's one of the points that we have to appreciate, that in order really to have stability and growth in Jewish life, you have to have stability in the society. Because only when there's stability in the society can the infrastructure grow and take root and exist. But if the society has no infrastructure, and it has no stability, so then the Jewish world will also fall apart. I don't want to digress, but that's part of the story of America, of changing neighborhoods, etc., is that it led to the demise of Jewish tradition and the acceleration of assimilation simply because the Jewish infrastructure was destroyed. We move out to the suburbs, you're the first one there is no shul there. And there is no kosher butcher. So, after a while, you're buying the A&P. And that's what happened here. So the chafetz chaim took strong measures, aggressive measures, he together with the Chaim Ozer, to try and create some sort of Jewish infrastructure in the midst of this terrible condition of wartime, chaos, of the destruction of all of the communities. Now the war itself would have been bad enough, Russia versus Germany. But in 1917, in early 1917, in February, the Russian Revolution began. The Tsar was overthrown. So here we have one of the great famous stories of the chafetz chaim. Again, whether or not it's completely accurate, I cannot attest to. But the fact that the story is told undoubtedly should be taken into account. I've heard the story from a number of sources, some of whom claim to have even been there when the words of the chafetz chaim were uttered. But there was a student of the yeshiva who came from Germany and who was trapped by the war and continued with the chafetz chaim first to Plight and then to Sinyat. And he eventually was arrested by the Russian secret police and accused of being a spy for Germany. It was a trumped-up charge, but naturally there was very little that could be done. The chafetz chaim did everything possible to have this student released. He appealed to all sources. He went himself to the governor general of the area to appeal to make and to declare the innocence of this student. There's a famous sequel to this story, which I just heard now in Eretz Yisrael. The chafetz chaim, the chief of the secret police, said to him, "Rebbe, can you take an oath that he's not a spy?" And they knew that the chafetz chaim, or almost any Orthodox Jew, would be very loath to take an oath for any reason. So chafetz chaim said that he didn't want to swear, but that he is certain. So he said to him, "How can you be certain?" He said, "A spy is a spy. A spy, the whole genius of a spy is that he doesn't reveal himself." So the chafetz chaim said to him that a rabbi has a sense of Ruach HaKodesh. He has like divine inspiration in these matters, and that he knows that he's not a spy. Now, I heard that same story told in Jerusalem now, with a man that was arrested by the British. He was 14 years old. He was arrested by the British for being a runner for the Yidun in Jerusalem. He came from a very religious home, and the parents and the British then were going to send him to Kenya. They sent the whole shipload of suspected members of the Irgun and of the third gang, those whom they did not execute. They're placed in prison in Accra. They sent them to exile in Kenya. And the boy's parents were naturally distraught beyond words, both from a personal and physical fashion as well as a religious thing, to send him to Kenya. So they asked Rabbi Herzog, the son of Avrocha, the late great chief rabbi of Israel, to intercede with the British on their behalf. And so the British commandant said to Rabbi Herzog, he said, "Rabbi," he said, "are you sure that he's not a runner? I mean, his parents don't know where it is. Nobody knows what he's doing. How are you sure?" So again, he said the same words that the chafetz chaim said. He said that a rabbi has a Ruach HaKodesh. A rabbi has an instinct, a godly instinct in these matters, and that tells him that the student, that the young man was not involved in it. But in spite of all of the protests of the chafetz chaim, the student was found guilty and was sentenced to be sent to Siberia for 20 years hard labor. And the sentence was going to be carried out in 3 days. The chafetz chaim was reputed to have said, 20 years, they don't even have a week. And 3 days later, the Russian Revolution broke out and the Tsar was deposed. When the Russian Revolution broke out, the Jews were overwhelmingly in favor of it, the first revolution, because the Tsar was the worst. Anything would be better than the Tsar. And especially the Kerensky government, the first 9 months after the Tsar was deposed, that was built upon ideas of democracy, free elections. A Duma, a Russian parliament, was elected. For that parliament, the Jews put up Jewish parties to run. Now in Europe, unlike the United States, there were parties that were Jewish parties. There's no Jewish party in the United States. There's Republicans and Democrats. There are Jews in both parties. Even though Jews in the United States may vote, the majority of Jews may vote for one party over another party, there's no exclusively Jewish party. But in Europe, that was true in Poland, Lithuania, Russia, wherever there were elections, there were Jewish parties. With socialist Jewish parties, secularist Jewish parties, religious Jewish parties. And that's the tradition that is carried over into Israel today. And the chafetz chaim, together with other great rabbis, united the religious Jews into one party. The name of the party was called Achdut, meaning united. And together with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, with Shalom Dov, and with Rabbi Ritzel Aponovitcher and other great rabbis, the chafetz chaim, they were the sponsors of this religious party. And the party was going to run in the elections, but the Bolshevik Revolution negated all of this. but it shows us the concern and again the ingenuity of the chafetz chaim, and the fact that he was able to unite very disparate parts of religious Jewry to run as one party. When the Bolshevik Revolution occurred, so then we came to one of the worst times in the history of the Jewish people in Eastern Europe, because the Jews were caught in the civil war between the Reds and the Whites. Since many Jews were prominent in the Russian Revolution, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, large proportion, Kaganovich, others. So the Jews were labeled as being Bolsheviks, as being Red. On the other hand, the Jews were very poor Bolsheviks, because the Bolsheviks wanted to completely eliminate religion, tradition, etc. And the Jews, the Bolsheviks, were bitterly anti-Zionist and anti-religion. Well, the Zionists and the religious were the majority of the Jewish people. So the Bolsheviks said that the Jews were white. I mean, they were anti-revolutionary. In no situation that whatever happened, the Jews were slaughtered. They were slaughtered indiscriminately. They were slaughtered by the Reds. If the Reds warned the town, they were slaughtered by the Whites if the Whites warned the town. The chafetz chaim was bitterly opposed to the communists. The chafetz chaim said that one should take a sword in one's hand to fight them. To go to the streets and literally fight them with their one hand, bare hand. And later on in life, he felt that when we'll see when he returned to Poland and he fled from Russia, later on he said perhaps he regretted that they should have stayed in Russia and fought, even to sacrifice themselves against the communist regime to make certain that they would not eradicate all vestiges of Judaism in Russia, which is what they tried to do. The Russians had a group called the Esvexia, which was the Jewish section of the Communist Party. These were the Jews that destroyed Judaism. The Russian Communist Party used Jews to uproot Judaism, and they were more ferocious and more anti-Jewish and anti-religious than the non-Jewish communists. And the chafetz chaim again led the attempt to try and fight against them. There are many stories. The chafetz chaim personally was such a holy man that even the worst enemies were afraid to start up with him. And there's a story told about a commissar, the Red commissar in Sinyat, who took ill, and he sent messages that the chafetz chaim should pray for him, which, if you think about it, is not as incongruous as it sounds. And then later on, well, no one knows whether the chafetz chaim did pray for him or not, but later on when he recovered, so during the time that he remained the commissar there, he saw to it that the yeshiva students were not persecuted and that they were supplied with food and taken care of, because he felt that the presence of the holy man of the chafetz chaim himself saved his life. There are countless incidents such as that. The fact that it doesn't reflect on anything else. I mean, the Polish peasants who lived around Rodin would attempt to entice the chafetz chaim to walk on their field, simply feeling that if he walked on their field, a blessing would come to the field. That did not prevent them from participating in pogroms. It did not prevent them from desecrating the Jewish cemetery, from anything. So you'll say, well, then how can that be? Well, that's the way human beings are. Finally, the chafetz chaim fled again to a city called Snovsk in Russia to try and avoid this civil war, but the civil war pursued him even there. And eventually the yeshiva was forced to close. The communists, the commissars, the Bolsheviks forced it to close. And it went underground. In that it met in clandestine places. It was in constant flux and transition. It had no base. And it was always at the risk of being caught and, if not killed, at least exiled, which was tantamount to being killed. When the war ended, so the chaim attempted to come back to Poland. Now, the war ended in 1918, but the war in the East did not end until 1921. By that I mean, you had, first of all, as I pointed out, the civil war between the Reds and the Whites, but then you had a series of wars between Poland and Russia and between Poland and Lithuania. And in these series of wars, you also had a tremendous war between the Ruthenians and the Poles, the Ukrainians and the Poles. In all of these wars, the Jews were the victims. Over 150,000 Jews were killed in the Ukraine alone in 1920 and 1921. So all the borders were closed, all the roads were dangerous. There was no place that was safe. There was no place that was home. There was no place where anyone could find any sort of comfort or solace. And it was therefore not easy to return to Poland, because Poland did not have an open border with Russia. Poland was engaged in a war with Russia. It's one of the ironies that Poland won the war. By winning the war, it sealed its doom, because it became overconfident. Somehow it felt that it was a major power that could defeat Russia. And the Russian there was not about to forgive Poland. And when the opportunity arose, Russia moved in on Poland and still controls Poland to a great extent today. In any event, the chaim tried to get back, but it took him years. He didn't get back till the end of 1921 to Rodden. In the interim, his son-in-law, Reb Hirsch, died, and that was a tremendous personal blow to him, because Reb Hirsch was the mainstay of his books and of his efforts, and he was also the mainstay of the yeshiva. He was the administrator, the organizer, etc. And that blow was, out of all the personal blows, was perhaps the greatest blow that he suffered. By the end of the summer of 1921, he came back to Rodden. He was able to return to Rodden. And when he returned to Rodden, he published a report as to what had happened to him. I just want to repeat this letter of the chaim, which he wrote in 1921, which summarizes what happened to it. He said, in the 6 years that I was in exile, in Smilovitz, in Yats, and Snof, the yeshiva was able to maintain itself through the generosity of the Jews in that area. But he says at the end, the Bolsheviks came, and they declared that everybody has to work every day of the week, including Shabbos. And they took all the students of the yeshiva and put them in forced labor battalions and forced them to work on Shabbos. And the chaim says, I was unable to prevent this from happening. And therefore, since it's impossible to observe the Torah or to even mention God's name, so I determined to leave at all costs, because one cannot live in a place where the Torah cannot be observed. And therefore, he said that's the reason that he returned to Rodden. Again, as I mentioned to you, he had always pangs of conscience of having left Russia, because of the fact that he felt that somehow his presence or his efforts could have strengthened it. In 1921, when he returned to Rodden, he found Rodden ruined. The war had passed over Rodden. The yeshiva was very small. The town itself was economically in shambles. The Jews there were very depressed, and many of the Jews had become secularized. And he set about to rebuild the town and the yeshiva. He did this through the efforts, first of all, the Joint Distribution Committee, the Central Relief Agency of the United States, provided a great deal of money to help rebuild the Jewish communities after the First World War. And also through SS Torah, which was founded here in the United States, he was able to obtain funds. And he set for himself the goal of rebuilding physically the Jewish people to such an extent that in 1923, when he was already in his 80s, he agreed to undertake a fundraising mission to the United States to raise money to help the Jewish situation in Eastern Europe. Coming to the United States from Poland in 1923, you didn't get on an airplane. It wasn't a question of 12 hours, 15 hours. It was a question of months, probably, certainly weeks, and a difficult travel condition. And it was only through the Herculean efforts of his family that he was dissuaded from doing so. But he felt it to be of such a nature, of such importance, that his own presence was necessary. Later on, others came, that may have done Plotsky, Rav Kook, the Nation More Chafetz, others came to raise money, the Mayor Shapiro, to raise money here in the United States for the rebuilding of Eastern European Jewry between the wars. The chafetz chaim, to show you what type of character he had, the Joint Distribution Committee supported the yeshiva for almost 4 years. Then they decided that they could no longer support it, or that they would no longer support it. In any event, they sent them a letter. And the letter arrived in the yeshiva, and it said, from this day forward, you cannot expect any more funds from the relief agency, from the Joint Distribution Committee. That caused such consternation in the yeshiva that they hid the letter from the chafetz chaim. They didn't want him to see the letter. They didn't want him to be pained by it. But all good news eventually gets out, especially in the yeshivas. And he was informed about the letter. His reaction was that a letter be sent to them immediately thanking them for the help that they had given in the past, so that they should not feel that they were not appreciated. It's an amazing insight, because I know from my own personal experience of institutions and people that were helped for many, many years with thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then when the help stopped for whatever reason, not only did the institution say thank you, but that they came with complaints and all sorts of demands. How dare you stop? When a person becomes accustomed to something, that's understandable. When a person becomes accustomed to something, so then he thinks he's entitled to it, even though it's a gift to him all the time. And in fact, we think about life that way. But the chafetz chaim, whose value system and whose understanding of the world was much more accurate than that, much clearer than that, he realized that you have to write him a letter and say thank you, even though that imposed a tremendous burden on the chafetz chaim. In 1923, Yahudus Yisrael organized a famous convention in Vienna, in which the Knesset Gdola, the great gathering of all of the leaders of traditional Jewry, Eastern European Jewry especially, to try and unite them in a force against all of the problems which existed in post-war Europe. Problems, the external problems were anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic governments in Lithuania and in Poland, communist government in Russia. The internal problems had to do with the secularization of the Jewish people, the problem of the relationship to secular and national Zionism, and the general destruction of the Jewish community in Eastern Europe. And the chafetz chaim, again, even though he was already in his 80s, traveled to Vienna to attend the convention. He was given the honor of making the opening speech, in which he said that he doesn't understand why the honor was given to him to address the convention when there are so many greater personages than he was present. But he said he comforts himself in the fact that he thinks that he's the oldest of the group. In the words of the rabbis, in Chochma ein kan, Hikna yesh kan, if wisdom is not here, but at least age is here. Age counts for something in Jewish life. A person that lives a long time is entitled to respect simply for the experiences of having lived a long time. And he said also because he was a Kohen, since the kahuna is entitled to certain privileges and honors, So he understood why they chose him. By that time, however, his voice was very weak. As I've mentioned to you many times, he was a very small person physically, and he never was a robust person. And his words had to be given over by translation, by an intermediary. They did not have microphones, and therefore it had to be, it was called a meturgeman. I once heard a story from Rabbi Meir Karelis, who was the secretary to the chafetz, whom, when I was a young boy, came to Chicago, and I heard him tell the story that the chafetz once was called to speak on behalf of the Vadai Yeshivos that they were to speak about in a moment, and it was in the major synagogue in Warsaw, a synagogue that held thousands of people, and the chafetz mounted the platform to speak. And he said, it's of no use that I will speak because no one will hear me. I cannot project my voice past the first or second row. So it's a useless exercise that I should attempt to speak. So they told him, Rebbe, don't worry, we're going to put somebody up. He'll repeat your words. He'll be a meturgeman. Meturgeman means someone that will repeat your words. So the chaim said, Dvorim Shebelev is nitokin meturgeman. Meaning, the Talmud says that words that come from a person's heart enter the other person's heart. That it's not just the volume or the style of the speaker, it's the sincerity of the speaker. And if the sincerity is present, then people will hear what you have to say. So he said that my sincerity cannot be given over by a meturgeman. It cannot be given over by someone who translates my words. But here he did speak, and his presence was one of the strongest encouragements for the Aguda and for the ideas that it represented. In 1924, he, together with Reb Haneza Grodzinski, established the Vadai Yeshivos. The Vadai Yeshivos was an organization of all the yeshivos in Lithuania and Poland, and it unified their fundraising methods. And it was meant to be a head tax on every Jew who lived in Eastern Europe to give a certain amount, about $1 a year. And it was collected in all the towns, and then given to the Vadai Yeshivas under the direction of a Chaim Ozer, and distributed to all of the yeshivas. Now, the Chaim was tireless in his efforts for the Vadai Yeshiva, and till the Second World War, it remained the main fundraising body that supported the yeshivas in Eastern Europe. Because the Chaim, all of his life, wanted to travel there to Israel. He wanted to settle in the land of Israel. He wanted to leave the exile. And in 1925, again, when he was in his middle 80s, he decided that he would leave. And he made all plans. He was going to leave Rodden, and he was going to move there to Israel. One of his reasons for moving there to Israel was that he felt that he would be able to make peace with the warring religious camps which existed in Israel, especially in Jerusalem. Then there was the great dispute regarding Rav Kook and Rav Zonenfeld and the Eid Acharedis and all of the other problems which have never been resolved, by the way, in Israel. We are still witness to it 65 years later. And the inner friction that rends the Jewish camp into two. The Chafetz said in his inimitable, almost naive fashion, he said that when he comes to Jerusalem, he said people will see an old Jew that sits down and weeps over the situation. He said maybe that will help ameliorate. They see that there's an old Jew that is so disturbed by it that he sits and weeps. So maybe that'll have an influence on them. Now, when the news got out that the Chafetz wanted to leave Europe and move there to Israel, so then the leaders of Eastern European Jewry appealed to him not to. So Chafetz said, I'm an old man, I can't do any more. He said, let me go. So they said to him the famous example that Reb Salanter said, that for the old father, even though he doesn't work anymore and he can't do anything for his children, but as long as he sits at the head of the table, there's a family. Still in order. If the father goes, so then wanted to leave. He packed all of his goods. He shipped them to the port. And he prepared to leave in the summer of 1925. A week before he was supposed to leave, his wife took ill and required an operation, surgery. When she recovered, his daughter took ill, and he could not leave until she got her strength back. That took about 6 months. And then when they got better, the chaim himself felt himself too ill to undertake the journey. So his words were, Mina shamayim itruni. Heaven held me back. Heaven doesn't allow me to go. For some reason in heaven, they don't want that I should have the privilege of going to Eretz Yisrael. Again, in retrospect, if the chaim was going to Eretz Yisrael, who knows? Maybe it would have been a different Eretz Yisrael. But he was held back. He did not go. The chaim was so upset over the news, the constant news of persecution coming out of Russia, because beginning in 1923, after the death of Lenin, Stalin took over. It became worse instead of better. And the persecution of Jews and of the Jewish religion, by then it was almost destroyed. Chaim was so disturbed by it that he wrote a letter to the Pope, demanding that the Pope make a statement regarding the matter. Now, there are different versions of this, whether the letter was ever sent. It could be that the letter was written and not sent. But whatever we say, there was never any response from the Vatican, but the Chaim was so upset, it was one of the things that haunted him to the end, was the plight of the Jews in Russia. How 2.5 million Jews could be allowed to simply disappear without an intensive effort by the Jewish people to save them. In 1929, when he was almost 90, the chaim traveled to Warsaw to deal with another serious problem. The serious problem was the Polish anti-Semitic government, which passed constant decrees against the Jewish people. Decrees against the Jewish people economically. They couldn't stay open on Sunday any longer. Jewish businesses were taxed at a higher rate. There were problems with shechita. And Jews were beaten on the streets in Poland. They were taken off trains and beaten, and the police did nothing about it. One of the decrees had to do with Jewish education, that the traditional form of Jewish education had to be changed, and that the new modern form would be instituted, and the new modern form naturally meant the end of Jewish tradition. So the chaim in 1929, he himself, again, almost 90 years old, he went to visit the Polish minister in charge of it. And the chaim did not speak Polish. And the Polish minister did not speak Yiddish. So the people that went with him said again that they will provide an interpreter. The chaim said he doesn't need an interpreter. The chaim spoke to him, and when the chaim was finished, they said to the minister, we'll translate the remarks. He said, you need not translate them. And I know what the old man said. And he did bring about a slight amelioration of the situation. He got an exemption, he got it postponed. But again, the chaim was who, in his last years, in his later years, in his last years, he was a public advocate for the Jewish people in all of these areas. In 1930, he convened a rabbinic convention in Vilna of all of the rabbis of Lithuanian Poland to deal with the terrible crisis. Again, the crisis was economic, it was political, it was religious, it was educational, to try and do something. The chaim himself, again, in his old age, began again to travel from town to town to speak to Jews. That was one of his great slogans, was Medafreden Fariden. You have to speak to the Jewish people. My father-in-law, should live and be well, tells me that the chaim's last words to him were, go speak to Jews. That's your mission. Go speak to the Jewish people. Not to, the chaim didn't lock himself in an ivory tower. So he came to certain towns, he called the women of the town together, and he spoke to the women about matters of mikveh, paras mishpocha, about other matters, because he felt that the key to the family lay in the hands of the women. So he said in one of his famous remarks here that's quoted, that the chaim said, I know that people would laugh at me and say that in my old age I became a magnet for women. The great Rosh Yeshiva, the great Rebbe, he should come and be a magnet for women. But he said that, I don't care. He said, that's not a dishonor, it's an honor. Because of the fact that this is the way to attempt to build the Jewish people, to say what we can, to do what we can. The chaim felt instinctively, he mentioned it many times, that the times that we lived in, and he lived in rather, were times just preparatory to the end of days, to the coming of the Messianic era time. And therefore, he said, in that time, everything goes. Everybody has to do what he can. Like, you got your last good shot. And because there's so many troubles and so many problems and things are so bad, and therefore we have to do everything. And no one should say it's not my honor to do this or that. You have to do. Everyone has to do. And he was an example. 1931, he was 91 or 92 years old. He traveled from town to town. He was so old and weak, they carried him on a chair. Couldn't walk. They carried him on a chair, like on a sedan chair. But he felt that that was his personal duty to push forward with these issues, to make certain that the Jewish people would survive. Kol Hadaf died in 1933. His funeral was one of the landmark occasions, if one can use that word, that happened in Jewish life in Eastern Europe in the 1930s. Tens of thousands of Jews came to it. The Polish government itself almost came to a standstill because of it. But everyone felt that the departure of the chaim was... This discussion is regarding one of the great Hasidic leaders, Reb Yehuda Arya Leib Alter, the Ger Rebbe, who's known popularly as the Sfas Emes, after the name of his Sforim. I think that as difficult as it is to have a meaningful biography of any of the great men that I have taken the audacity to describe in this series, being able to describe a Hasidic leader is probably more difficult because of the fact that much of the facts and the aura are enshrouded in legend, purposely so, and that it's very hard to get, therefore, to the essence of the person because of the public image which is created. That's not to say that the public image and the private image are not identical, but it's merely to say that it's hard to get a handle on it in terms of a private person. However, the Sfas Emes, out of all of the Hasidic leaders of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was probably the most influential, because under him, Hasidus in Poland became such a mass movement. The Ger Hasidim had tens of thousands and probably hundreds of thousands of Hasidim. And it was the most influential and core base within traditional Jewry in Poland. And it also left its imprint on later generations, so that the Ger Hasidim today in Israel and here in the United States are of great influence and large numbers, and have a great deal to say about the future of Jewry. The origins of Ger lie in Kotsk. The famous Reb Menachem Mendel, the Rebbe of Kotsk, he was a brother-in-law of Reb Yitzchok Meir Alter. And Reb Yitzchok Meir Alter is the first Ger Rebbe. Reb Yitzchok Meir was known also by the name of his sefer, the Chidushei HaRim, Rim standing for Rabbi Yitzchok Meir. Rabbi Meir Alter was one of the great Talmudic geniuses of the 19th century, and he was well known throughout the Torah world for his erudition and for his insights and for his genius. He was also a great and holy and pious person, so much so that when the Rebbe Rabunim of Pshizka passed away and the Chassidim came to choose a successor, the group was split between Rav Yitzchak Meir and Reb Mendel of Kosk. And Rav Yitzchak Meir himself deferred on behalf of the Rebbe of Kosk. And during the entire time that Reb Mendel was alive, Rav Yitzchak Meir did not practice being a Rebbe, even though he was one of the leaders of the group. And certainly in terms of learning, in terms of Talmudic erudition, he was one of the greatest men in Poland. Rav Yitzchak Meir had 13 children. Tragically, all 13 children died in his lifetime. He survived them all. Apparently there was a congenital disease in the family. Many of them died in very young ages. But he had one son, Reb Mordechai, Reb Avraham Mordechai, who lived long enough to marry and who had a child, and that's going to be the Sfat Emes. The family name Alter was an adopted name. Their real name was Rottenberg. Just as the Kotzker Rebbe's name Morgenstern was an adopted name, his real name was Halpern. The reason that they changed their name is because of the fact that they were peripherally involved in support of the attempts of the Polish nationalists to revolt against the Tsar in the 1840s. And therefore, as a precaution, when the rebellion was put down by the Tsar, as a precaution, they changed their last names. Last names among Jews, especially in Eastern Europe, was not a sacrosanct matter. And you had many families where two brothers had different last names. So the Kotzkers, whose name was Halpern, became Morgenstern, and the Chidushei HaRim, whose name was Rottenberg, became Alter. Alter, by the way, part of the reason was because Alter traditionally has been a name to give people who need an extra boost, so to speak, to have a longer life. It's a name that is used in that sense. So his son, Rabbi Mordechai Alter, in 1847, after the father had been ill for a number of years, and in fact had almost died 5 years before the Sfat Emes was born, in 1847, the Sfat Emes was born, and he was given the name Yehuda Arya Leib. And the Sfat Emes, from his earliest moments on, was well known as a special child. And part of his being a special child was that his grandfather, the Chidushei HaRim, took him over from his infancy. Part of the reason was because his father was ill, and therefore his grandfather raised him. I don't want to be misunderstood, but there's a difference between being raised by a father and a grandfather. The attitude of a grandfather to grandchildren, I thank God I'm blessed with both feelings, but the attitude of a grandfather to a grandchild is much different than the attitude of a father to a child. And therefore, we can say that the Sfas Emes was the beneficiary of the fact that he was raised by the Chidushei Harim. The Sfas Emes himself relates a story which is illustrative of the difference between parents and grandparents, is that his grandfather would always inquire what he wanted to eat and make certain that the food that the child wanted was given to him. Whereas once when he was eating by his father when he was a small child, so his father, they had beans or porridge or something to eat that the child did not like. And the child expressed himself at the table, as children do. Terrible, who can eat it, right? So his father made that for the next 30 days, that was the menu. And he told him that you should, to train yourself, that you don't say on food, you have to learn to eat everything. That's the difference between a father and a grandfather. The father's 100% right. You can't let the kid grow up because then his wife will have to retrain him. Eventually, you're going to have to eat spinach. But the Sfas Emes, in relating the story, gives us a window to his childhood, because his childhood was with his grandfather and not with his father. And it is his grandfather, if you'll see in the Sforim of the Sfas Emes, he always quotes his grandfather. He almost never quotes his father, because when he was 9 years old, his father died. But even before, his father was always sickly, and his main education and his main upbringing was under the tutelage of his grandfather. So he constantly quotes his grandfather, and there's no question that his grandfather was his teacher, his mentor, his role model, and the person that set him on his way in life. And again, it's different when one is raised by a grandfather than by a father. The Chidushei Harim himself was noted for certain characteristics. And all of those characteristics were taken over by his grandchild, by the Sfas Emes. Number one was that the Chidushei Harim never wasted time. He was so industrious, he never wasted time. They say that he would eat by the clock. In other words, he would eat for 10 minutes, and that was it. And then he would get up. And all of his life, he never slept more than 4 hours out of 24. The Gaon of Vilna never slept more than 2 hours out of 24 for the last 40 years of his life. The Chidushei Harim never slept more than 4 hours out of 24. And the Sfas Emes took over all of those habits. Later, when the Sfas Emes, who died when he was barely 58 years old, and who in his later years suffered physical infirmities, so he said he never regretted the fact that he didn't sleep much, because we'll see his regimen in a moment, that he didn't sleep much as a child, but he does regret the fact that he didn't eat properly. And his not eating properly